The rain was pouring, heavier than it had in days. It ran in rivers down the cracked pavement outside the small veterinary clinic, the streetlights casting halos of yellow light against the darkened sky. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, and the faintest hint of something burnt, like the last remnants of hope. The tiny puppy, no more than a few months old, trembled on the cold steel examination table. His eyes were wide, terrified, pleading. They weren't the eyes of a dog who simply feared pain. They were the eyes of a creature who knew something far worse was looming. Something inevitable. Dr. Karen Michaels, a seasoned vet who had seen it all, stood at the edge of the table, her face a mask of stoic professionalism. She had made her decision. It had been made the moment she saw him, this small, emaciated pup who had barely clung to life long enough to make it here. His ribs stuck out, sharp and jagged beneath his fur, and his thin, fragile legs quivered in a way that made it seem like the slightest touch could snap him in half. The puppy had been abandoned at the door of the clinic, the word euthanize, scrawled in block letters on a crumpled piece of paper left in his carrier. No one had even bothered to give him a name. But as Dr. Michaels prepared the syringe, her hand hovering just above the needle, something shifted. There was a sound, soft, muffled, but impossible to ignore. A cry, not a yelp, not a bark, but something deeper, something heart-wrenching. She turned to look at the puppy. His small body was trembling as he lifted his head, his eyes locking with hers. He wasn't begging for a treat or a toy. He wasn't even begging for food. His gaze was desperate, pleading, fighting, as if he knew, somewhere deep down, that this was his final moment, the one chance to survive. He opened his mouth. Barely a sound escaped, just a rasp of breath. But it was enough. A single tear slid down Karen's cheek, unexpected, as her heart caught in her throat. She hadn't been prepared for this moment. She hadn't expected to care about this pup. And then it happened. His trembling paws reached up, as if begging her not to let go. There was a rawness in his eyes, something she couldn't ignore. Please, the silent please seemed to say. Please, don't let this be my end. And in that silent exchange, Karen felt it a crack in her resolve, a surge of something she hadn't felt in years. The will to fight for this little life. Dr. Karen Michaels had never been one to make decisions lightly. In her 10 years of practice, she had seen countless animals brought in for euthanasia, abandoned, neglected, unwanted. But none had struck her like this puppy. His small frame, the bruises along his fur, and the way he gazed at her, as though he knew his life was hanging by a thread. The decision to end it, to let him go without a fight, was simple. Too simple? She had already signed off on the paperwork, preparing for what she believed was the best option for a creature suffering beyond saving. She had seen worse, after all. But the moment his eyes locked with hers, Karen was thrown into a conflict she hadn't expected. This wasn't about him being too sick or too weak. It was about something deeper. Was she really going to let this tiny, trembling creature slip away because it was easier? She found herself questioning everything. Her own professional detachment shattered in a single moment. She couldn't explain it, not even to herself. As the hours passed, the rain continued to pour outside, and the world beyond the clinic seemed to drown in its own sorrow. Karen sat in the back room, the paperwork in front of her, unsure of what to do. Her mind replayed the moment she had looked into the puppy's eyes. The storm outside had nothing on the turmoil within her. The phone rang, interrupting the silent battle in Karen's mind. Her hands shook slightly as she picked it up, the weight of the decision pressing on her shoulders. On the other end, a familiar voice. It was her colleague, Dr. Anders. She had called him earlier to consult about the puppy's condition. Now, his voice sounded tired, but there was an urgency to it. Karen, I know you're trying to save him. But listen, we've been through this before. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let them go. Her heart sank. It was the same advice she had heard countless times, but it felt wrong. She wanted to argue, but the words caught in her throat. She had seen animals recover against all odds, fought tooth and nail to bring them back from the brink. Couldn't she do that here too? Was it really time to give up on this little one? But the doubt lingered, gnawing at her. What if this was her final chance to make the right choice? She had been a vet long enough to know when to let go, but this felt different. His eyes, they haunted her. That night Karen couldn't sleep. She lay awake, the sound of the rain tapping against her window like a quiet whisper. Her mind kept returning to the puppy. She could hear his faint, labored breathing in her mind, feel his tiny paws reaching up toward her, his silent plea echoing through the dark corners of her thoughts. The decision was supposed to be clear-cut. But in the stillness of her room, she couldn't stop thinking about the life she might be ending. What if she was wrong? What if there was a chance he could survive? She knew the science. His chances were slim. But she also knew something else, something that could never be measured in numbers: the power of will. The power of hope. As the dawn broke, she made her decision. She wasn't going to give up. She wasn't going to let this puppy die without giving him a chance. She would fight for him. He deserved that much. By morning, the clinic was a blur of activity. Karen had already started the treatments, an IV line running into the tiny puppy's veins. She was giving him everything she had, every ounce of her energy, her expertise, and her heart. She couldn't let him slip away. Not yet. Not when he was still fighting. Hours passed, each one feeling like a lifetime. The puppy's breathing was steadier, his body less tense. But it wasn't enough. Karen needed more. She needed a miracle. She stayed by his side, her hand resting on his small chest. The faint thump of his heartbeat under her fingers was a lifeline, a reminder that he was still here, still holding on. His fragile body, so close to giving up, seemed to defy every expectation. Karen's heart swelled as she watched him struggle to lift his head, his eyes flickering open for a brief moment, meeting hers. It was a small, fleeting moment, but in it, she saw something. Hope. The puppy wasn't ready to give up, not yet. It wasn't the treatments that saved him. It wasn't the medicine. It was something far simpler, something far more human. Karen watched as the puppy, once so frail, managed to curl up into a ball, his breathing now deep and steady. When she reached out to him, her fingers trembling as she stroked his fur, he looked up at her. And then, for the first time since she had met him, he didn't look scared. He didn't look lost. He looked grateful. Tears streamed down Karen's face, silent and unbidden, as she realized what had just happened. The puppy had taught her something. The fight, the will to live. It wasn't about science or reason. It was about love. And in that moment, Karen knew that sometimes saving a life wasn't about the right treatment or the right timing. It was about fighting when everything else told you to let go. Days passed, and the puppy continued to fight, against the odds, against the silence of doubt that often settles in when no one is watching. Karen could see it in him, a strength that wasn't in his tiny body, but in his soul. He wasn't just surviving, he was living. Every morning, she sat by his side, watching as he slowly gained strength, inch by inch. It was nothing short of a miracle. His body, once frail and thin, now held a small glimmer of life. The tiny whimpers that had once escaped him, full of fear and pain, were now soft, contented sighs. He had begun to trust her, to seek her presence as though it was his only anchor in this world. Karen didn't know when it happened, but there came a moment when the puppy lifted his head and nuzzled into her palm, closing his eyes in pure surrender. That she realized he had saved her too. She had fought for him, but he had fought for her in ways she could never have imagined. The uncertainty that had plagued her heart in the days following his arrival began to fade. She knew that this puppy, this little fighter, had given her something beyond her professional pride. He had given her back a piece of her own humanity. His recovery wasn't instant, but it was steady. Each day, he grew stronger, and each day, Karen found herself growing more and more attached. It was more than just the connection between a vet and her patient. This was something deep, something primal. It was love. The clinic had become quiet. The usual hum of activity, the constant flow of animals and their worried owners, had shifted. There was something different now, something palpable in the air. Karen couldn't help but feel it every time she walked into the room where the puppy lay. No longer a trembling mass of fur, but a creature learning to trust again. One afternoon, as the sun filtered softly through the clinic windows, casting long shadows against the walls, Karen found herself sitting on the floor beside him. She had a bandage wrapped around her arm where she had gotten a little too close to a cat's claws earlier in the day. But she hadn't even noticed. All of her attention was on the puppy, who was now standing on his wobbly legs, still uncertain but determined. It was as if he was testing the world around him, his small, trembling steps slowly gaining confidence. Karen watched him struggle for balance, then finally take his first few steps toward her. Her heart swelled as he made his way over to her, his tail wagging just slightly, unsure but hopeful. Then, without warning, he collapsed, his tiny body falling to the floor in exhaustion. Karen rushed to his side, panic gripping her chest for a moment before she saw the look in his eyes, a look of pure determination. He wasn't giving up. A wave of emotion washed over her. How many times had she wanted to give up in her own life? How many times had she felt like she couldn't go on? And yet here he was, so small, so fragile, and yet pushing forward with everything he had. She gently scooped him up, cradling him in her arms as she whispered, "I won't give up on you, little one." It was time. Karen had known this day would come, the moment she would have to make the ultimate decision. The puppy, now stronger, his fur gleaming with newfound health, had been living in the clinic for weeks. He had grown attached to her, and she to him. It was more than just a bond between a vet and a patient. It was something deeper, something that could no longer be ignored. She had a choice. The puppy needed a home, a real home, one that wasn't filled with sterile smells and the hum of machinery. He needed someone who could love him, someone who could promise him a life beyond the clinic walls. But Karen was torn. She wasn't sure she could let him go. She wasn't sure she could part with the tiny soul who had revived something deep inside her, who had taught her about fighting and about loving. But there was a responsibility she couldn't ignore. There were others who needed her care, animals who hadn't found their miracle yet, and the puppy deserved a family who could give him the life he deserved, one filled with love, warmth, and endless possibilities. That afternoon, as she sat with him on the clinic floor, the decision became clear. She could give him a new beginning. She could let go and let him find his forever home. It had been 2 weeks since Karen made the heart-wrenching decision to give the puppy up for adoption. She had spent every day wondering if she had made the right choice, questioning her own strength. But as she watched the tiny creature that had once been so frail run excitedly toward his new family, her heart broke, but it also soared. His new owners were kind, gentle souls who had fallen in love with him the moment they laid eyes on him. He was no longer just a fragile puppy. He was a survivor, a fighter, and he had found a home that could offer him the life he had fought for. As Karen stood in the doorway, watching the puppy snuggle into his new owner's lap, she felt something she hadn't expected: peace. It was bittersweet, yes, but there was peace. She had done her part. She had fought for him, given him everything she could. Now, it was time for him to live his life, the one he had earned with his silent, unwavering plea for help. The puppy had taught her more than any medical textbook ever could. He had taught her about resilience, about the beauty of small victories, and about the quiet strength that could rise even in the most fragile of bodies. As the door closed softly behind them, Karen's heart felt full, and she couldn't help but smile. She had saved him, and in the process he had saved her too. The clinic fell into its familiar rhythm once again. But for Karen, the echo of the puppy's journey lingered, reminding her that sometimes the greatest miracles come in the smallest packages. And as she looked out the window, where the sun was beginning to set, she whispered a quiet thanks to the little fighter who had stolen her heart. In the distance, the sound of a dog's bark could be heard, clear, joyful, full of life. And Karen knew, without a doubt, that the puppy had found his home. And in that simple, pure moment, everything was right in the world. Weeks had passed since the puppy had been adopted, and the clinic had returned to its usual hum of activity. The other animals came and went, some with broken bones, others with wounds that needed mending. But Karen couldn't quite shake the emptiness that lingered, a quiet ache in her chest that had nothing to do with the work she loved. The puppy, the little fighter who had changed her life, had left a permanent mark on her soul. It was a kind of emptiness that only comes when you've shared something raw, Something unspoken, something that no one else could ever understand. Some days, Karen would catch herself glancing at the empty bed where the puppy had once curled up, his tiny body nestled in the blankets she had laid out for him. She could still see the light in his eyes, the way he had fought to stay alive, and the way he had looked at her with trust and desperation. She missed him, more than she had expected. It was a peculiar kind of loss, one that couldn't be quantified or fixed with a single moment. The bond they had shared was too deep to be erased by time, and as she went about her day, treating the animals in her care, Karen couldn't help but wonder if she had done the right thing. Was he happy? Did he understand that she had let him go because she wanted the best for him? She couldn't know for sure. But the thought of him in the arms of his new family, his new life, gave her a small, bittersweet comfort. It was early one morning when Karen opened the clinic door to find a familiar face standing there, a little older, a little larger, but unmistakable. The puppy. Now a young dog full of energy with his coat gleaming in the early sunlight. His eyes, the same ones that had pleaded for her not to let him go, were wide with recognition as he bounded toward her, tail wagging furiously. For a moment, Karen froze. She hadn't expected to see him again, at least not like this. He was no longer the fragile creature she had fought to save. He was strong, healthy, and undeniably happy. And there, standing before her, was his new owner, smiling warmly as she held the leash loosely in her hand. "Karen," she said, her voice full of gratitude. "We just wanted to stop by and thank you." Karen knelt down to greet the puppy, now named Max, and he immediately jumped into her arms, his body a little bigger than before, but still the same affectionate creature who had once looked at her with those desperate eyes. "We're so grateful for everything you did for him," his owner continued, her voice filled with sincerity. "He's been a joy to our family. We just wanted you to see how far he's come." Karen's heart swelled as Max licked her face, his eyes bright with happiness. She could see it now, the fullness of his life. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. He was loved. That afternoon, Karen sat on the clinic's porch, the warmth of the sun filtering through the trees. Max, his new family sitting close by, lay on the ground, content, watching the world go by. There was a peacefulness in the air, the kind that only comes after a long struggle, after a journey that's been filled with uncertainty, hope, and perseverance. For Karen, it was more than just a visit from a former patient. It was a reminder of why she did what she did. The small victories, the moments of doubt that led to breakthroughs, the realization that sometimes the most important thing isn't just saving a life, but giving it the chance to thrive. She watched Max chase after a ball, his tail wagging as he sprinted with the pure joy that only a dog could possess. His family laughed, calling his name as he darted around them in a whirlwind of excitement. It was everything she had hoped for, everything she had fought for when the decision to save him had seemed impossible. The puppy had become a symbol, not just for her as a vet, but for the fragile hope that had remained within her, even when she had doubted herself. There was a certain peace in knowing that the fight had been worth it, that the life she had helped save had found its purpose, its place. And as Max ran across the yard, his newfound family cheering him on, Karen felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. She didn't need words to understand the depth of what had transpired. Sometimes, the greatest victories were the ones you couldn't see. Months went by, and life in the clinic continued. Karen's patients changed, but she couldn't forget about Max. He had become a quiet presence in her heart, his memory a reminder of the fragile lives that passed through her care. Every animal she treated now felt a little more personal. Every decision made with a little more weight, a little more tenderness. In the evenings, after the last patient had been seen and the clinic quieted down, Karen would sit in the small office at the back, flipping through the file of the puppy, now a young dog. She had kept the records, but more than that, she kept his story close to her heart. It was the story of a life saved, yes, but it was also the story of the growth she had experienced, the way he had helped her reclaim something lost. Karen couldn't tell you exactly when it happened, but somewhere in those months, she had become a better vet, Not just because of the things she had learned in school or the techniques she had perfected, but because of the lessons she had learned from him. Max had taught her about patience, about hope, about resilience. And in return, Karen had given him something she couldn't have known he needed: a chance. As Karen walked out into the evening, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange, she felt a sense of contentment settle over her. Max had found his home, and in some ways so had she. In the end, Karen knew that the story wasn't just about one puppy, one fight for survival. It was about something larger, something more universal. The ways in which the smallest lives can change us. The ways we can be called to action by something as simple and pure as a plea for help. And as she stood in the twilight, watching the stars begin to emerge, Karen allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that every life, no matter how small, mattered. They all had stories. They all had their battles. And sometimes, just sometimes, the right person comes along to give them the chance to tell their story. She smiled softly, her eyes glistening with quiet understanding. The legacy of the puppy, now a dog, would stay with her forever as a reminder of the healing power of love and the strength that comes from never giving up. It had been a year since Max had left the clinic, but Karen still remembered the way his small body had fit so perfectly in her arms. The warmth of him as he nestled against her chest, trusting her in a way that no one else had. Even after all this time, the memory of his eyes, the desperation, the pleading still haunted her in quiet moments. But now, when she thought of him, it wasn't with sorrow or doubt. It was with pride. Max had found his place in the world, and in doing so, Karen had rediscovered her own. The clinic had changed too. There was more light now, more laughter. Karen had started to open up more to her colleagues, sharing stories of the puppy, telling them about the bond she had shared with him. It had been a quiet healing process, but one that had transformed the way she approached every patient. She was no longer just a vet. She was someone who understood what it meant to fight, to risk everything for a life that seemed too fragile to save. Max's story had become a part of the clinic's story, a testament to the fragile thread that connects all of us. Every time a new patient came in, especially the ones that were small, fragile, abandoned, Karen would think of Max, and she would know without a shadow of a doubt that if there was a chance, she would fight for them. She would never give up. The clinic's waiting room was filled with the usual sounds, murmurs of nervous owners, the quiet shuffle of paws on tile. But now, there was something different in the air, a sense of purpose. Every animal that came through the door was a new story. Karen saw them not just as patients, but as lives to be cherished, each one deserving of her care. And more than that, she saw them as potential fighters just like Max. That afternoon, as the clinic door opened, Karen looked up to see a small, trembling puppy standing in the doorway, his ribs jutting out beneath his matted fur. His eyes were filled with fear, the same kind of fear Max had once carried. But something inside her stirred when she saw him. She didn't hesitate. Bring him in. She called out softly to the owner, her heart already making room for him just as it had for Max. As the days passed, Karen poured herself into helping the new puppy, just as she had Max. The tiny creature, no more than a few months old, was fragile and scared, his eyes wide with the kind of pain only those who had been abandoned could know. But Karen had learned to see beyond the surface. She knew that with the right care, the right love, even the most fragile soul could grow strong. She worked tirelessly, giving him food, warmth, and comfort, just as she had done for Max. She wasn't sure if this puppy would survive, if he would make it to the next step, but she refused to believe that he didn't deserve a chance. Each day brought small victories, his tail wagging a little more, his tiny paws finding strength, his body beginning to heal from the physical wounds of neglect. And as the days turned into weeks, Karen found herself attached to this new little life, just as she had become attached to Max. She hadn't expected it, but the same bond was forming, slow and steady. In the stillness of the clinic, as she sat beside the puppy, watching him sleep, Karen thought of Max. She thought of how far he had come, how far they both had come. She had given him a chance to live, and in doing so, she had rediscovered something in herself she hadn't even known she had lost. And so, As she looked at the new puppy, she felt that familiar tug of determination in her chest. She wasn't just a vet, she was a guardian of these small lives, each one holding a story, a future that was worth fighting for. The months continued to pass, each one filled with new challenges, new animals needing care, and new moments of growth. Karen had learned to accept that this was her life, her calling. She had learned to embrace the rhythm of it, the quiet moments of reflection, the busy rush of treating a new animal, and the inevitable heartbreak of saying goodbye to those who couldn't be saved. But she also knew that every life, every small victory, was worth it. The puppy who had once trembled in her arms was now a healthy young dog, one who had been given the chance to live. And as Karen watched him run around the clinic, his tail wagging, his eyes full of life, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Her work wasn't just about medicine. It was about the moments between the treatments, the small acts of kindness, the quiet times when she simply sat and listened to the animals. It was about giving them something more than just survival. It was about giving them a future. As the sun began to set, casting a soft golden glow over the clinic's parking lot, Karen stepped outside for a moment to breathe. The air was cool, carrying the scent of fresh rain from earlier in the day. She closed her eyes, feeling the quiet peace that had settled over her life. In the distance, she could hear a dog barking joyfully, and she smiled. Max. She imagined him out there somewhere, running in the grass with his new family, his life full of everything she had hoped for him. She had given him a chance, and in return, he had given her everything she needed to believe in the power of second chances. Karen stood at the edge of the clinic, the wind gently brushing against her face, the world around her still and peaceful. She thought about how far she had come, the struggles, the doubts, the small victories that had led her to this point. And, as she looked at the stars beginning to appear in the sky, she knew that Max's journey had been the catalyst for everything that had followed. His story had changed her in ways she couldn't have imagined. And now, as she looked out into the quiet night, she understood something she hadn't fully grasped before. Saving lives wasn't about one dramatic moment, one big rescue. It was about the quiet acts of compassion that filled each day. It was about the trust, the patience, and the love that you gave, even when it seemed like the world was too broken to fix. Max had taught her that. And with every animal that walked through the clinic's doors, Karen knew she would continue to carry his lesson with her. Because sometimes, the smallest creatures have the biggest impact. With that thought, Karen smiled and turned back to the clinic. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new animals to care for, and new moments of hope. But for now, she felt content. Her heart was full, and she knew that, in some small way, she had made the world a little bit better. And that was enough. The morning sun had barely risen when Karen stepped into the clinic, her heart already racing with the familiar anticipation of a new day. The routine had settled into something comfortable, but today felt different. She could feel it in the air, a subtle shift. Something was coming. It wasn't just another day of treating patients. Today something new was on the horizon. As she passed by the reception desk, she saw a familiar face. A woman, her eyes red and swollen, holding a small, trembling bundle wrapped in a dirty blanket. Karen's heart sank. She had seen this before. An animal brought in for a final chance, barely hanging on. "Please, I need your help," the woman said, her voice strained with panic and fear. "I found him on the side of the road. He's hurt, and I don't know what to do." Karen's mind instantly went into overdrive. She could see the small form shifting in the blanket. She could hear the faintest, rasping breath escaping the little animal's lungs. There was a desperation in the woman's voice, a silent cry for help that Karen had heard too many times before. "Bring him in," Karen said, her voice calm but firm. As the woman handed her the puppy, Karen felt the same cold weight she had felt the first time she had held Max. The sense that this tiny creature was teetering on the edge, needing someone to fight for it. Without a second thought, Karen carried the puppy to the treatment room, already reaching for the tools she needed to assess his condition. There was no time to waste. The puppy was pale, his breathing shallow, his tiny body trembling with each breath. His heart was racing, but his pulse was weak. As she began to examine him, Karen's mind raced. He was just like Max, she thought, a flicker of determination igniting inside her. This puppy needed the same chance. He needed someone to believe in him, the way she had once believed in Max. She couldn't let another soul slip away, not when there was still hope. The hours seemed to stretch endlessly as Karen worked, her hands steady but her mind filled with the urgency of the situation. She administered fluids, pain relief, and carefully monitored the puppy's vital signs. His condition was grave, but Karen refused to give up. There was a part of her that understood what he was feeling, his pain, his fear. It was all too familiar, too raw. The clinic had grown quiet, the usual buzz of activity replaced by the soft beeping of monitors, the rhythmic sound of breath filling the room. Karen's focus never wavered. She had fought for Max, and she would fight for this little one too. As the day wore on, the puppy's condition remained precarious. Karen didn't leave his side for a moment, her eyes never straying far from the IV line, her ears tuned to the faintest changes in his breathing. The hours stretched into the night, and Karen felt the weight of exhaustion press down on her, but she pushed it away. Then, around midnight, something shifted. The puppy's breathing deepened. His body began to relax, ever so slightly. It was the first sign of improvement, the first indication that maybe, just maybe, he was going to make it. Karen sat back in her chair, allowing herself a moment to breathe. Her hands were slick with sweat, her body sore from hours of focus, but her heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The puppy was still with her. He was still fighting. The next morning, Karen walked into the treatment room with a heavy heart but cautious optimism. The puppy was still breathing, still alive, his tiny chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. He was a long way from recovery, but Karen could see the spark in him, the will to survive. She sat down beside him, her hand resting gently on his fragile body. "You're going to make it," she whispered softly, though she wasn't sure if he could hear her. She had said the same thing to Max all those months ago, when he had been in this exact position. She had told him that he would survive, even when the world around her had said otherwise. And now, as she looked down at this tiny creature, she realized that it wasn't just about the animals she saved. It was about the strength she found in them. Every life she fought for taught her something new. Every story, no matter how painful, had its own lesson to offer. By the time the sun set on that second day, the puppy was showing signs of real recovery. His eyes, though still clouded with confusion, had softened. His tiny tail twitched as Karen gently fed him his first solid meal. His body was still weak, but the strength was there, slowly building, inch by inch. Karen knew that there was still a long road ahead for him, but she also knew that he was no longer just a helpless, abandoned puppy. He was a fighter, and he had a future that Karen would fight for with everything she had. Weeks passed, and the little puppy continued to fight for his life, his body slowly gaining strength each day. Karen had grown attached to him, as she had with every animal that walked through her clinic. But this one was different. This puppy, who had been found abandoned, broken, and alone, had come into her life at a time when she needed him the most. As he grew stronger, Karen watched him transform before her eyes. He started to play, tentative at first, his tiny body wobbling as he tried to chase after toys. His tail wagged with increasing confidence, and his eyes, once clouded with fear, now shone with a growing light of trust. One afternoon, as Karen sat with him in the clinic's yard, watching him bound across the grass with newfound energy, she felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. The fight hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And then, as if to seal the bond they shared, the puppy ran over to her, his small body full of excitement, and jumped into her lap, just as Max had done all those months ago. Karen smiled, the warmth of his tiny body filling her with a sense of peace. This was what she had fought for, the simple joy of seeing a creature who had once been broken find his way into the world, full of life and possibility. The puppy, now named Leo, had grown into a healthy, happy young dog. It had been months since Karen had fought for his survival, and now he was ready to take the next step. His time at the clinic had come to an end, and it was time for him to find his forever home. As Karen watched Leo play with the family who had come to adopt him, Her heart swelled with pride. He had come so far beyond the tiny, trembling creature she had first held in her arms. And as she handed him over to his new family, she knew that she had done everything she could. She had fought for him, just as she had fought for Max. "Thank you," the new owner said softly, looking at Karen with gratitude. "We'll give him the best life." Karen's smile was warm and knowing. She could see it in their eyes. Leo had found his place. He was finally home. As the family walked out of the clinic, Leo's tail wagging joyfully, Karen felt a deep sense of peace. Another life had been saved. Another story had come full circle. And in that moment, she knew that no matter how many animals she would fight for in the future, she would always carry the lessons they had taught her. Karen stepped outside, the sun casting a golden glow over the clinic as it began to set. She looked up at the sky, the same sky that had watched over Max's journey, and felt a quiet gratitude settle in her heart. She had given Leo a second chance, just as she had given Max. And in return, they had given her everything she needed to continue her work. To continue fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The world was full of fragile creatures, each one deserving of a chance, and Karen knew with certainty that she would continue to fight for them, one life at a time. Because sometimes the smallest lives make the biggest difference. And that was enough.